Australia's public affairs channel.
Thanks for coming along tonight to hear Michael Danby make his first appearance at the Sydney Institute. Michael's well known to many of you, but I'll introduce him briefly. He was educated at Melbourne University, where he became president of the Students' Representative Council. He spent some time, part-time, in the army. He worked as an arts gallery manager. He was an editor of a newsletter, but of course from 1998 the Labor member for Melbourne Ports. He's held numerous positions, but I'll just mention a couple of them. He was Parliamentary Secretary to the Gillard and Rudd governments. He's now currently Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, and Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for the Arts. He's also a board member of the Henry Jackson Society and of the World Movement for Democracy. And Michael's a very well-known politician from Melbourne, and we're delighted to have him here at the Gallipoli Club in Sydney, and he's going to speak tonight for the Sydney Institute on the topic responding to the Caliphate from Israel to Iraq. Mr. Danby, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. First, I'd like to dedicate this speech to a dear elderly friend of mine who passed away this morning, Erwin Lamb, Zichrono Livracha, who his memory is a blessing, who was one of the Dunera boys. I missed his funeral to be here tonight, but I know he was a particular stalwart on this issue of Israel. He was a refugee from the Nazis and victim of them from Vienna in Austria, and one of the many people who made a great contribution to Australian life. So I'd like to remember him in particular. And I'd also like to thank Gerard and the Sydney Institute for having me. I've resisted sillily opportunities to speak here before on other matters, but I'm very pleased to be here tonight and to be able to make these remarks to you. They're particularly appropriate because just 2 weeks ago I was in Jerusalem with my wife for the Israel-UK-Australia dialogue, which takes place in Jerusalem. And whenever my wife and I are in Israel, it's our custom to visit my brother's in-laws, the Gulpers. Dr. Gulper is a twice retired doctor of geriatric medicine who worked at the Barzilai Hospital in Ashkelon. He's much beloved in the city of 120,000 people. Zico and Blima are a hospitable couple in their 80s, and both of them quietly, stoically, over the last few weeks of this war, have stayed in their homes despite the entreaties of their friends to take refuge further north. Amanda and I thought visiting Israel, it would be an absolute act of cowardice not to go down to visit them, as we have on every other previous occasion. And their experiences and my experience there reminded me a bit of the stories Amanda's late father Peter used to tell me about his nights during the Blitz, sitting in the Anderson shelter during World War II. Sure enough, as soon as we got there, red alert, the powerful air raid siren sounded over the city. Snowy the dog went straight to the safe room. The dog, like other pets in the south of Israel, is on tranquilisers, not just as a result of the previous 27 days of the military operation, but as a result of the unceasing and unreported missile attacks on Sderot and Ashkelon over the years. Sderot has the only fortified childcare centre I've ever seen in the world. It's closer to Gaza. During the 27 days of continuous missile attacks and occasional days since, where Hamas broke 5 ceasefires, sirens sound sometimes 6 to 7 times a day in Ashkelon. Iron Dome, its missile defence, is miraculously effective most of the time, although 250 metres either side of our family home, missiles have landed over the last year. Similar situation in Ashdod, 15 kilometres further north, with 200,000 people, and a similar situation in Beersheba, where the famous charge by the Australian Light Horse was made, where now 220,000 people live. That's further east. Altogether, 5 million Israelis are under the range of Hamas's unguided missiles, which, if not successfully shot down by Iron Dome, might land anywhere in populated centres. At least 65 Fajr 5 or M75 rockets were aimed at Tel Aviv. The even more powerful M302 missile provided by Iran has reached even further north to the edge of Israel's northern port city of Haifa. Kippat Barzel, as the Israelis call Iron Dome, shoots 2 missiles at the heavier Hamas rockets aimed at Tel Aviv and Haifa and is successful in 90% of cases. The system calibrates whether a Hamas rocket is going to land in unpopulated areas. Kippat Barzel only responds if the Hamas rocket is going to hit a population centre. Kippat Barzel only works, however, when coupled with civic defence and an informed population who seek cover in shelters or safe rooms. This effective defence meant that some Western journalists were nonchalant about the safety of Israelis under missile attack. Understandably, the 5 million Israeli civilians who were facing such a prospect weren't so casual. Now, South Korea, Gerard, is thinking about buying Iron Dome. Let's hope they do for their own safety, but let's hope Kim Jong-un doesn't imitate the spokesman of Hamas, who told Jane's Defence Weekly, "We are trying to deceive Iron Dome by firing dozens of rockets at the same time and from different places towards different targets, which distract the detection systems." So even with a technological miracle like Iron Dome, it's possible to overwhelm it by sending off barrages of these missiles, as they have over the last few days. 150 have landed in the last day and a half. Let us hope that jihadists don't try the same tactics in Australia or any other country that is in conflict with them. It's best to have good relations with our Muslim neighbours, such as Indonesia, and of course we here in Australia are enhanced by sort of being out of missile range, unlike the Israelis, who live at very close proximity to their neighbours and have a completely different geographical situation. One of the things that I found particularly bizarre during this conflict was the journalistic demand that the need for proportionality. I think it's a postmodernist mindset that demands equal bloodletting in a struggle with an Islamist opponent. Sometimes it doesn't seem to matter to Radio National or whoever is reporting this thing who breaches the ceasefire and what the nature of the two sides are. In my view, one side being an open democratic society with all its faults, who should politically agree to compromise with its Palestinian neighbours, the other side being a group that both Egypt and the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, think is a group of extremists. Only a mixture of the technological miracle of Iron Dome and the weary civic stoicism of the average Israeli trudging to the shelters saved their lives. And I just want to hold up this map that was in The Economist, which shows the range of these missiles. I'm happy to pass it round to the audience, but it shows that virtually all of Israel south of Haifa was at some time in the last period subject to missile attack. Very big number of people, and understandably would impel any democratic government to act in regards to what Hamas was doing. Strangely, in Australia, as far as I'm able to discover, no editor published such a map. It's a strange war where there are no pictures of Hamas soldiers or missile launches from civilian sites, a topic I'll return to. Well-spoken suits like the Israeli spokesman Mark Regev will never win a media message juxtaposed with dead or maimed civilians in Gaza. Australia's perspectives would have been enhanced if, in my view, they had known that when Tel Aviv or other towns were attacked, on any given time, at any given day, hospital patients, including emergency patients, expectant mothers and newborns, were expected to gather in the stairwells of multi-storey hospitals. Newborns, of course, were scooped up and held by infant nurses. Every building over 3 storeys, you'd have a maximum of 40 seconds to seek shelter in the basement, or you had to go into the stairwell. You can't use a lift in an attack like that. I know from personal experience it takes more than 40 seconds to get down a 3-storey flight of stairs. And in Bat Yam, population 130,000. Some of these places are in the part south of Tel Aviv. In Ashdod, 210, Netivot 28,000, Kiryat Malachai 20, and Yavna 48,000. These are more humble towns of working class and middle class people in the south. Style of living, it tends to be in 6 or 7-storey apartment buildings, and you can imagine when red alert goes off, if you're an elderly person or a disabled person living on the 6th, 5th or 4th floor, not able to make it down to the basement, what trepidation it causes. On freeways, when you're driving and red alert goes off, you're instructed just to drive. People on regular roads in these areas are to lie with their hands over their head in the gutter or to run under the awnings of buildings. Thus, Hamas missiles pose a real danger to Israeli lives, and that's why, however strong public support for a 2-state solution amongst the Israeli population, which is some 80%, there's a seemingly counterintuitive, nearly universal support for Protective Edge, the military operation in Gaza, amongst the Israeli population and in the Netanyahu government with its small L liberal allies of Tzipi Livni and the biggest coalition partner led by the George Clooney lookalike Yair Lapid. It's surprising to me that none of these balancing images were caught by The Age or The Australian, although the ABC, in particular Matt Brown, its Jerusalem correspondent, made some effort to explain the human side of the Israeli situation. A former editor of The Age, who now writes for Business Spectator, reflected that the reporting of the conflict had raised questions that everyone in Australia was being fed a story that Australia must hear. He said, why, for instance, do reporters never declare the serious Hamas-imposed limitations that they work under in Gaza? Why do we never ever see a Hamas military commander being interviewed? Why, in the constant flow of images of death and soul-searing images, do we never see Hamas rockets being fired, some of which fall within Gaza and in some cases, killing people? Why is there no reporting of the summary execution of Hamas, of Gazans who were accused of being collaborators? It does raise serious questions, in my view, about the balance of reporting when here in Australia we see an absence of those images. By contrast, on Indian television and on France 24, footage of the Hamas missile launches from civilian areas was caught towards the end of the conflict. To their credit, both CNN and the BBC broadcast the Indian television footage. It seems, unfortunately, that our ABC did not. Now, Qatar, which finances both Al Jazeera, is also the main financier of Hamas, or as Egyptian television calls them, the owner of Hamas. If we're talking about the Islamic State, last night the German foreign minister officially condemned Qatar for financing the Islamic State in northern Iraq. And this is a place where we're going to have the World Cup. I'm not sure that will take place after what the German minister has said. So maybe there's another chance for the Sydney bid. I don't want to be parochial about these things. Policymakers have to face the fact that Qatar's irresponsible financing of Islamic extremism is not just a problem for Israelis. Al Jazeera published a post-conflict list where it's clear that a high proportion of the casualties were male. The BBC and the New York Times further broke this down by arguing that an analysis of the casualties showed that 33% of those killed were males 20 to 29, although they're but 10% of the population. Now, these macabre calculations show, according to the former British officer commanding in Afghanistan, Colonel Richard Kemp, that 50% of the casualties were Hamas militants, as they're called. They're terrorists, by the way, if they're killed fighting Australians or English, killing English civilians, because they're terrorists for other people. They're terrorists when they're fighting us. They're militants when they're fighting other people. And by the way, in all 5 countries of the Anglosphere, as it's called, Hamas is officially declared a terrorist organisation. It's important to highlight that in this conflict, the civilian casualty rate was relatively low. In Afghanistan, the ratio was 3 to 1. In Iraq, 4 to 1. I don't want to pursue this, but it's no wonder that Hamas's support amongst the Palestinian population, according to Pew Research, was but 11% prior to this conflict, and will remain low, in my view, which is a political opportunity I'll talk about, despite their control of Gaza. I think it's best summed up by Musa Abu Marzouk, who's the deputy head of Hamas in Gaza, who said very brutally, "What are 200 martyrs compared to the lifting of the siege?" That was reported, in case someone doubts me, in the Sydney Morning Herald. Let's return to what John Lyons called the genesis of this conflict. First, I have to join every serious Jewish commentator in condemning utterly, and I'm pleased that it's being pursued legally, the death of that Arab boy. But AIDS journalist Ruth Pollard and the Australian's John Lyons questioned Netanyahu's claim that Hamas was responsible for the murders of the 3 Israeli teenagers. This is the event that they said, that Lyons says, sparked this conflict. Given the prominence they gave to this alleged bad faith, it seems strange that they didn't follow it up. I can tell you tonight that Mahmoud Qassama was the Hamas official in Gaza who helped organise and fund the operation. In fact, Hamas is now on Lebanese television tonight, just before I came here, admitting that they did the operation. Mohammed Qassama was assisted by his brothers Hussam, who was arrested in the West Bank, and Marwan Qassama and Amr Abu Aish, who both of whom are on the run and who actually did the murders. Qassama, and you can understand the bitterness of this for the Israelis, was one of the 1,000 prisoners exchanged in 2011 for Gilad Shalit. Paul Monk, whose views I respect on this issue, the former senior intelligence analyst, argues that there are some important considerations that are indispensable to thinking about this Israeli incursion in Gaza that would balance the way it was reported. He says the death and injury of women and children is almost invariably one of the tragic consequences of war. That's an obvious common sense point, and one of the reasons why we all should work not just in this situation, but in all situations, to avoid war and conflict. It's abhorrent. Of course, Monk makes comparisons with the justifiable civilian deaths resulting from the Allied bombing in World War II, but that was a conflict fought without the immediacy of television. Such just wars are also fought before, and I believe this is a very profound reason, and I'm happy to examine it further in question time, before the Belgian Nazi Paul de Man invented the doctrine of postmodernism, which is so pervasive amongst our educated classes, and particularly amongst journalists, where there is really, well, I don't have to explain postmodernism to you, but they see all points of view and all societies as equally odious or equally good. In my view, The Economist and Mr. Rothkopf, the editor of Foreign Policy, wrote a famous essay about this, Israel lost the war in Gaza, are correct. If one looks at the coverage of Gaza and the predictable reaction of the UN and its dictator-dominated Human Rights Council, Rothkopf says Israel may win the military battle, it's struggling in the world for world opinion. There's no Iron Dome that can protect Israel from images like that of the 4 boys on the beach, apparently killed by Israeli naval gunfire. Regardless of any loaded UN inquiry, I've received assurances from the highest level of Israeli authorities that there will be a thorough investigation into this. And indeed, I think that's one of the lessons for all of us in confrontations like this with jihadist violence. Our own civic law-based standards cannot and must not be compromised. We have to investigate incidents like this for our own morality and because of our own ethics. No Western society, however just its cause, can prosecute conflict where television and Twitter almost pornographically report civilian casualties. If Australia's SAS killed, as they have, innocent civilians in the course of authorised military operations against the Taliban or against Al-Qaeda, how long will the Australian public permit military engagement if the ABC or foreign networks were to name and picture every infant and woman who died in every firefight or drone attack? Monk argues that we must understand the context of this conflict. And let's just restate it. When Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, Sharon offered the Palestinian leaders a deal: make peace, develop Gaza as a thriving entrepot. Fatah was ousted by Hamas in a brutal coup. The Israeli offer was spurned. Hamas is not in the business of negotiating a settlement with Israel. Its charter is the destruction of Israel by any means possible. Now, fortunately, at the end of this conflict, there is some, and I'm always an optimist, some of the people in the audience who are friends of mine criticise me for being an optimist always. There's a possibility of a united, moderate Sunni group of countries led by Egypt, including the PA, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, supervising Gaza in some kind of political process if we get to a permanent ceasefire. I agree. Political strategy must follow military strategy. Confronting the Caliphate or the Islamic State, we have to leverage local actors. Similarly, in the case of Egypt, in the whole Arab world, and in the case of northern Iraq and Syria, the Sunni awakening or the Sunni tribes. Third, Monk argues the peace process with regard to the Israelis and Palestinians centres on the two-state solution. This has been on offer since 1937 and in the following division by the United Nations, in which Australia voted yes to division of Palestine into 2 states, a Jewish state alongside an Arab state. It was offered by Barak and Clinton to Arafat at Camp David in 2000, by Olmert to Abbas in 2008, and it was the subject of the offer that just failed. But we have to have an equitable political program that we can cling to, that we can work to, that provides some kind of justice. Hamas bears many of the characteristics that's also prevalent in the Islamic State. In my view, it's the Caliphate writ small. The same lack of economic opportunity, the same longing for jihadist medievalism, the same inability to make democratic or economic progress that characterises the wider Middle East. That's Hamas's legacy to Gaza. Extremist violence in Syria or savage repression with 160,000 people now dead is a system that prevails throughout the Middle East. So in my view, when the bell tolls for Israel confronting an Islamist opponent like Hamas, it also tolls for us in the sense that we need to beware of the possibilities of what the Islamist revival in particularly northern Iraq might mean for the whole world. We've got 200 fanatics going backwards and forwards there, led by the abominable Khaled Severed Head Sharif, who face and what he did to his son will be remembered in infamy. If these fanatics return or are self-generated as they were in Boston to Australia, we run the risk of mass casualty attacks. And you therefore understand when I'm saying this that Israelis simply can't comprehend the hatred for them as they see it in the West. They see themselves and think that they are at the coalface of a fight between 6th century barbarism and advanced capitalist democracy. Hamas and ISIS don't have formal links at the moment. Hamas says its goals are sublimated to Islamic rule and Sharia law, and even the far left, who will demonstrate with them, echo their slogan, from the River Jordan to the sea. What that means is an Islamic state in the whole of Palestine, geographic Palestine, excluding Israel, from the river to the sea, means there's not two states, there is only an Islamic one. Hamas may have more localised goals, but ISIS sees itself as the global successor to Al-Qaeda. And the self-styled Caliph Baghdadi, when he was released from US custody in Iraq, insolently told his captors, "We will meet again in New York." There are important commonalities between both groups: the use of violence and intimidation to implement a reactionary version of Islam that persecutes women, minority and other religions. We've seen the vicious persecution of groups in northern Iraq on the television every night. I don't have to remind you of them. But Hamas's charter is similar. It says, quote, "The day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews, when the Jews will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, 'O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.'" That's in the political charter of Hamas. Now, Australia's one of our premier political historians, Paul Kelly, argued the other day that the image of the jihadi son holding up the severed head is an iconic picture that brings issues to the fore in the Australian public imagination. Sooner or later, we, like the Israelis, will be confronted what to do about such barbarity and how we confront it. The words of Gaza's Catholic Archbishop Alexios, in charge of a very small Gazan Christian minority, echo the same kind of persecution and fear faced by the Iraqi Yazidis and Christians. Archbishop Alexios said in an interview with the Christian Broadcasting Network, quote, "Islam is the rule of this place, and whatever Hamas says we must obey or face the consequences." Alexios was filmed with a reporter describing how Hamas used the roof of his church to fire rockets into Israel. Now, I return to Paul Monk's gloomy conclusion. There is no way to punish Hamas for its relentless provocations without inflicting harm on Arab civilians. This is the harsh reality of the situation. If you do not take them into account, you'll not be able to hold an informed or responsible conversation on the subject. Pity, partisan anger and frustration don't suffice. I must say, when I see 3 demonstrations in London of more than 50,000 people in a month, 200,000 people in Cape Town, prospective violence in Australia, including the Sydney school kids who were terrorised, an Orthodox rabbi beaten up in a Perth shopping mall, I can't help but think there's something strange afoot even here in our blessed, peaceful Australia. Thank heavens, as we engage in the fight with ISIS in the future, there won't be a pompous old venerable like the BBC's Jon Snow spluttering with rage to shout down a US or Kurdish version of poor Mark Regev. Israel is, for geographic reasons, in the forefront of the resistance against radical Islam. It's on the forefront of indiscriminate attacks against innocent civilians in the name of a radical religious ideology. The month prior to the battle between Israel and Hamas demonstrated that attacks on innocent civilians may confront Western societies in the immediate future. George Gilder said his perspective was that Israel has become a crucial battlefield for freedom. Those who support modernity will support it, he says, because it is a leader of human civilization, technological progress and scientific advance. I like my friend Doug Murray from London's Henry Jackson Society in yesterday's Spectator. He says, Of course, one line of argument claims that if we just left all of these places alone, then none of this would come to us. But we left the Balkans alone and created one generation of jihadists. We left Afghanistan and Iraq alone and created another generation of jihadists. Now we have very much left Syria alone, and lo and behold, we seem to have created another jihadist generation. Damned if you do, damned if you don't, apparently. Yet remarkably few people seem to understand that this is not really about us or about what we do. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. What we have seen subsequently is multiple conflicts between Hamas and Israel and a more moderate Palestinian group on the West Bank. Hamas, much like those fighting under the banner of the Islamic State, have only one political method, and that is armed violence. Sooner or later, this violence in the name of radical Islam will fall on other Western lands. What we need, in my view, is the same kind of stoic and united response I witnessed in Israel, saw in my brother's relatives. Australia will realise that throughout this conflict that they have not been given the full picture. I've tried to outline some of the Israeli narrative today, and that sitting back and letting rockets rain upon civilians, 5 million of them in the last day and a half, is simply not an option for any country. Equally, we need to keep working for and arguing for diplomatic solutions, reasonable and rational political compromises that avoid war and conflict. Never should it be clearer to Australia why our top foreign policy goal should be continuing good relations with our most populous Muslim neighbour to the north, the most populous Muslim state in the world, Indonesia. We need to do this even in the face of irrationality on the other side, if for no other reason to maintain the internal cohesion, amity and democracy of our societies. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Many thanks to Michael Danby. We've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. He kept exactly to time. I should say thanks to the Gallipoli Club for providing this facility here tonight, and as I said, the restaurants are open as we leave. So we come to questions and discussion. Michael Danby, you've raised a lot of matters in a thoughtful address, but you also focused on Qatar, and you quoted the German minister as saying that it essentially finances Hamas or controls Hamas. In Australia, if, I'm not talking CIA, but if the United States Information Group, USIS, wanted to set up a news broadcast, before it appeared on the ABC, there would certainly be a cry that this was an official finance United States news service that would have to be done. But as I understand at the moment, Al Jazeera on the ABC is not identified as a Qatar finance news organisation. Do you think it should be?
That's a great question, because of course USIS was abolished a few years ago, Gerard, so the Americans aren't so much into doing their own PR anymore. But Al Jazeera, look, I think it's becoming known publicly that Qatar has strong views and strong activities supporting Hamas, supporting ISIS, or IS as it is now, according to an official statement of the German government. I think the incredible behaviour it undertook in securing the World Cup against the Australian bid gives you some insight. I'm not talking about its politics, into the Machiavellian way that it operates. Yes, all countries and all regimes operate in a Machiavellian way, but when the Egyptian government says, as it did 2 nights ago, that Khaled Mashal was not able to sign the ceasefire because Hamas's owners in Qatar told him that if he signed it, he'd be cut off from all finances, it's getting beyond the pale. I think Qatar's reputation is something. It's not just a moderate Arab state, not just a wealthy Arab state. It's something beyond that, and we should be looking to not just the Israelis but to our Egyptian and Saudi interlocutors for their view of what Qatar is really up to.
Michael, I wanted to ask you something about Egypt, but I'm going to turn to a more pressing question at the moment relating to worldwide communications. The Western countries seem to be deciding to muzzle the internet regarding Islamic State's propaganda. Do you think that this is a wise move? For two reasons. One, that one must know one's enemy, one must know what they are about and who they are. Secondly, if you do muzzle them, they're an organisation that needs attention. Will they then turn to something far more dramatic to get attention?
Generally, I'm in favour of not censoring things, and I find out an incredible amount of information, and I stay up too late watching and reading it, as Amanda can testify. There's a Twitter account called Johnny66 which retweets from a Western point of view all of the Islamist activities in Syria and Iraq, and you can actually see live on Twitter YouTubes of ISIS latest activities in those parts of the world. It's interesting to see, if you're making comments on them, those kind of things. So generally not in favour of censorship, but I would put one caveat on it. When the Director General of ASIO comes to the Australian Parliament and to the Australian public and says that he has to have certain powers to see whether people are reading the Al-Qaeda newsletter, Inspire, I think under proper judicial warrant and under proper authority, we need to seriously look at those requests. I know Gerard and I have a bit of a bête noire in the Institute of Public Affairs. They poo-pooed and laughed at ASIO's proposals in these areas because they said, ho, 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 Al-Qaeda is proposing pressure cooker bombs, and isn't this something out of Mad magazine? And a few months later, that's what the Sonarov brothers used in Boston, off Inspire magazine, to destroy and kill people at the Boston Marathon.
So there's a question there. Yeah.
Someone just recently said that we are all living in Israel. Some of us don't know it yet. So, and through you, I want to thank the Jewish people to fight our fight, really, that's what they do. But my question goes to the impetus from where this Jew hatred comes in the coverage of the recent, this conflict. It is, I think, of course, driven, Islamically driven, but also by the left. Are you feeling very much alone?
Okay, so the suggestion is this issue is not simply driven by Islamists but also by the left. And the question is, are you feeling alone?
Well, first of all, there is fair criticism and unfair criticism. There are people in the left of the Labor Party, the Greens, etc., who I vehemently disagree with about this. I wouldn't say that they're anti-Semitic. I think that they just have views that are formed, and quite understandably, as all of us, were the shocking images of civilian deaths in Gaza. What I tried to communicate to you tonight was that there's another story too. There's another story that you should have been told about what it's like for a democratic society to operate under missile attack, and how a society behaves and protects itself through miraculous technology and the sort of stoic behaviour of the population in making sure that they're not killed by these oncoming missiles. Look, there are at some of these demonstrations very ugly sentiments being put, but they're a minority of people. We shouldn't get hysterical about them, and I think people are intending violence against other Australian citizens. It's a police problem. I think the New South Wales Police here, for instance, have a very good understanding of the difference between political criticism of Israel and people who would like to do harm to other Australian citizens. That's a difference that they should keep very much at the front of their mind, and act against those people who want to initiate violence. We don't want ISIS coming to Australia. That's the basic message that you should take out from my speech tonight.
They're a very vigorous and noisy minority, aren't they? Anyway, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Recently, retired General Lay was quoted as saying that we should be prepared for a 100-year war against the Caliphate or against the Muslim activity. What do you think about that?
It seems very hard, doesn't it? Right? Normally, the attention span of democracies, particularly the United States, seems to be very time-specific. They like to be in and out of there and to achieve something, otherwise the whole thing is a failure. It's a very hard prospect for us all to face, but you know, if we are to beat this kind of barbarity, we're going to have to be in it for the long term. And I think General Leahy was arguing just to prepare public opinion for the fact that things are not going to change rapidly for the better in the Middle East, and we are very fortunate in Australia that, unlike Europe, unlike the United States, we haven't had any serious, well, not serious, any mass casualty attacks here in Australia. We've got our laws. Our laws have had people arrested, charged, jailed, and that's a very good thing that under the rule of law these people have been able to be handled. I hope that is a situation we can continue to maintain.
Would your party support to put boots on the ground in Iraq, Israel, Australian boots then?
Would Australia support boots on the ground in Iraq? Would the Labor Party support that?
I don't think so. I don't think the government would either at the moment. I mean, if the situation
said it clearly that he would. So
hang on. Okay.
But look. I think he then hasn't proceeded with it because the circumstances haven't demanded it. Look, one doesn't know what future circumstances will be, but at the moment I think it's responsible for Australia to offer assistance to the fleeing minorities in northern Iraq. I think more important is that we give police help to our friends in Indonesia who are concerned about people leaving for the Middle East and coming back and doing evil in this part of the world. That's the kind of area that Australia can make a valuable contribution in, and we've been very successful at it, by the way. I must say that I think all of us are very surprised at the success of post-Bali, the Indonesian government with Australian and AFP success in assistance in particular, running this campaign against Jemaah Islamiyah, which in fact ran them into the ground and have prevented nearly all terrorist attacks in Indonesia and certainly them coming to Australia.
You claimed in your speech that Israel supports a two-state solution. How then do you reconcile the continued land grab by Israel of various bits of real estate in the West Bank in the form of...
Okay, there's a question about the statement about the incompatibility between a two-state solution and land settlement on the West Bank.
Well, first of all, the point I was making in the speech was the juxtaposition of Israeli public opinion, 80% of which is in favour of a two-state solution, with the overwhelming support for this military operation in Gaza. Second point is a fair question to ask, and it's in the detail of the response that I think people need to know more about this issue. As I understand it, in the last since 2008. Since the Wye River Agreement, there have been no new settlements established in the West Bank beyond Jerusalem that have been approved by the Netanyahu government. There have been unauthorised small settlements, some of which have been dismantled by the Israelis, but they admit themselves that these kind of settlements are unauthorised. What we're talking about that agitates critics of Israel and supporters of the Palestinians is the building of homes in the suburbs of Jerusalem and the areas around Jerusalem. Now, if you look at all of the agreements that have basically been talked about between Barak and Clinton and Arafat in 2000, between Olmert and Abbas in 2008, and in the recent circumstances, if you speak to any of the negotiators or speak to any of the people there, the area of swapping land, giving the Palestinians 3 or 5% of what's Israel proper in order to compensate for those small areas around Jerusalem, which would incorporate 80% of the Israeli population across the Green Line, are not the big issue. The big issues are the right of return of Palestinian refugees, the sovereignty of Jerusalem, etc. So reasonable people, perhaps including you and me, who want to see a resolution of this conflict, we can discuss circumstances where, with land swaps, the population of the two sides can be basically incorporated in their own state. We need to get those negotiations back on track and further developed. But land swaps and territorial compromise is not the largest and most difficult issue.
There's a question here, then we go here, then we go there. Yep. Got to be quick. Yep.
Just a quick question on the tunnelling. I was surprised that it was said that the Israelis did not know that there was tunnelling under the border when the Palestinians have been tunnelling under the Egyptian border for years, smuggling stuff in.
Very good question. I couldn't cover everything in the talk, so I didn't...
I haven't met a mining engineer, that's why I was asked the question.
Well, some of them are works of engineering that are incredible. They're 3 kilometres long. The big fear in Israel was that there would be an attempted mass casualty attack on the kibbutzim, the settlements just next to Gaza, where, say on Jewish New Year, you know, there's a service in the morning, all the kids are gathered together, etc., and that large numbers of them would be kidnapped by people just jumping out of the ground at the back of some kibbutz dining hall or in someone's backyard. All of these have been destroyed, as far as I understand. There were 32 major ones that led into Israeli territory across the Green Line.
So these are coming from Gaza Strip here into Israel here, and this is what, 3 kilometres? This is...
Well, the longest one is 3.1.
3.1 kilometre from the
so
border.
They're extraordinary works of engineering. And you see, this is the problem. The UNDP recently decided, that's the official UN agency, that some of the way that building materials, particularly concrete, had been misused by the consultants they employed in Gaza. And what they mean by misuse, they were given money for construction of schools and hospitals and other things, and it was used for this. Now, please, if you want international sympathy and support for being able to bring products into the West Bank, into Gaza, across the Israeli border, you need not to use the concrete that you're provided by the United Nations and Western donors for invading another person's territory and seizing children or you know, people in a kibbutz dining room. It's the wrong thing to do. It's a bizarre conflict. Israel was providing throughout this whole conflict 30% of the people in Gaza's electricity who were sending missiles on them. Nearly all of the food, medicine and humanitarian aid came in. I think that in the 27 days there were 3,000 tonnes of material taken into Gaza from Israel. So again, these are the kinds of things that people need to know to make a balanced judgment about this issue.
We're going to go down there, over there, up here. Yep, we've got to be quick, yep.
Is there any plausibility in the proposition that the so-called two-state solution is really just cant? Because the reality is that the Israeli government regards the status quo as the least bad of bad choices, and that there is no feasibility in having a divided country, as Gaza and West Bank would be, trying to be one.
The suggestion is that the Israel government is not really interested in a two-state solution.
There are, I can't disguise it, there are a major group of people in the right of Israeli politics who would hold that view. Nonetheless, there is a societal goodwill, this 80% who, if they could get the conflict off their backs, would be quite happy for a two-state solution. And this is, if you follow internal Israeli politics very closely, Mrs. Livni said recently during their negotiations with the Americans that she was very pleased that she'd been able to get Mr. Netanyahu so far towards signing on an agreement. They didn't get to the end because Hamas and Mr. Abbas wouldn't agree to various things, but obviously they have to move cautiously. After having these mass missile attacks on Israel, you could understand that giving access to the West Bank, where you would be 1 kilometre from the airport, might be something that any government would take cautiously. I mean, here in immense Australia, where we take 5 hours to fly from one city to another, it's a bit difficult to sort of tell the Israelis what they should do when there are demonstrators throwing rocks from the top of the Temple Mount down on people praying below, or where people are being asked to give a sovereign state access to territory 1 kilometre from your international airport. So we have to remain strongly in favour of political compromise. I think people over there need to work for it. Their friends need to urge them to continue to do it. But there has to be quid pro quo from the other side.
There's a question down there. Yes.
Yes, regarding the government's proposed anti-terrorist laws, just a few hours ago, the ABC Public has published an official statement signed by nearly 100 Islamic institutions, including Hizb ut-Tahrir and universities, sheikhs, imams, and Islamic institutions, denouncing them completely. I think we'll read about this in the paper tomorrow. Do you think we've reached the pointy end?
So there's a question about the statement put out today by a number of Islamic organisations objecting to the Abbott government's proposed national security legislation amendments.
Sometimes society has to decide to do things whether minorities like it or not. The bottom line for all Australians is we can't conduct political differences through violence. It's intolerable. And the most left-wing, the most liberal person in this room should be the person who's the most vociferous in favour of keeping our democratic traditions. We should all be united on that. And I'm sorry if people feel that measures agreed to by the Australian Parliament, measures that are strictly supervised, somehow impinge on them. Then they still have to be proceeded with, because the welfare of the general Australian population should be the prime concern of any Australian government. And I know the opposition has equally strong views on this that the government has. We have differences. We would like some extra privacy legislation. There's a great piece of legislation that was passed in New Zealand called data breach legislation, where you as an individual could sue corporations or organisations that abused your data. I think that would be a good complement to some of the very specific and narrow requests that Mr Irvine and ASIO have to prevent a mass casualty attack in Australia. You have to have a balanced understanding of these kind of things, but I wouldn't listen to these people in the end if the general welfare was at stake.
As you may know, some of the tunnelling technology actually comes from North Korea, but do you have any thoughts on the role of China in this? Because this is not an English-speaking European problem.
The suggestion is some of the tunnelling methods come from North Korea, and has China got any involvement in this?
No, the Chinese seem to be only interested in doing business with the Israelis and sort of buying their technology and investing. I think they have, that is their overwhelming concern in this part of the world and in that part of the world. One of the things, it's a sad thing to say, but you get a lot of Israelis who say to you, "Oh, we much prefer to deal with Asians because they're not as prejudiced against us as the Europeans are." It takes your breath away when you hear things like that.
We'll take a question here, then we go to Michael. Yep. Probably the second last question, I think. Yep.
Michael, just going back
That'd
to
be
the
brief.
question of the tunnels. My understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, my understanding is there are two kinds of tunnels. One were the terror tunnels, and the other into Egypt were the smuggling tunnels. Nothing to do one with the other. And people don't seem to understand that they're quite different.
The suggestion is they're terrorist tunnels and smuggling tunnels. The latter going into Egypt.
Yeah, the Egyptian government's very agitated about the smuggling tunnels, as you can imagine. It's sort of, and in fact, that was one of the reasons that prompted this conflict, because Egypt cut off. The current Egyptian government, led by General Sisi, regards Hamas as the Palestinian arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. They detest them. You should see Egyptian television on this. It's comic actually to watch it, but they were getting very large amounts of taxation, and certain leading Hamas officials benefiting personally from this taxation of goods brought into the tunnels from Egypt. But you're right, the tunnels into Israel were called attack tunnels, and they were to be all simultaneously opened and used in one opportunity sometime later in the year. It is a strange thing to say, but this conflict coming at this time actually preempted what might have actually been worse if they had been used successfully as they were planned to be.
Just before we go to the final question, just tell us what goes on Egyptian television in relation to Hamas.
Well, this is one of the things that I wish our Middle East correspondents reported. They are so vociferous about Khaled Mashal, the leader of Hamas in Qatar. They say things like, Khaled Mashal, the jihad is in Gaza, not at the five-star buffet in Qatar. Come to Cairo, we will drive you free of charge to the Gaza border, where you can go underground with, what's his name? They call him, what's his name? They mean Ismail Haniyeh, the Gazan Prime Minister. And they show pictures of Ismail Haniyeh playing soccer. He's a very large man. And he said, this is Ismail Haniyeh when he could still run. And it's on and on like this. But the point is that they really, it's very interesting to see the Egyptian attitude to Hamas. And I think in that attitude there is a seed of a possibility of, after a ceasefire is established, together with the PA, together with Jordan, together with Saudi Arabia, of some kind of coalition of all of us, which is of interest to all of us, of the moderate Sunnis who now must be frightened to death, having seen Mr Baghdadi in Mosul. The bell tolls for them too, and I think if we all don't act together on this issue, then we'll all hang separately.
Final question, Michael.
I think you've probably answered it, but you said that Hamas is sort of losing popularity in Gaza. The famous sort of agreement between Abbas and Hamas for a unity sort of government. Do you see any potential for PA or Fatah gaining the upper hand politically in Gaza in the short or medium?
Well, remember Hamas was elected not because of their political program, but because they were seen as relatively clean compared to the crooks in the PA, and so it's a very difficult prospect.
PA, we're talking about the
Palestinian Authority and Mr Abbas's Fatah group in particular. Remember, none of these people have faced an election since 2006. So both Mr Abbas and the Hamas leadership have a democratic mandate that's extended, in an incredible kind of way. I'm not sure anyone here, even in their biggest nightmares, would have thought that people in the New South Wales Parliament, or who used to be involved in the New South Wales Parliament, would like to have perpetuated those kind of things. But Mr Netanyahu had a critical attitude towards Hamas PA unity government supervised by Egypt before this crisis started. His attitude may have moved. We first have to get to the Egyptians and everyone controlling Hamas and the missiles stop landing on Israel. And when we get to that point, a political solution involving all the surrounding moderate regimes should be put into play, not just for the benefit of Israelis and stability in that part of the world, but for the Palestinian people who want to develop and live a modern life like the rest of us.
Many thanks, Mark. So it's been great to have the Parliamentary Secretary to Bill Shorten along tonight and talking on his recent trip to Israel and other related matters. Michael's a very hard-working politician. I got an email from him at 3:15 this morning, as I recall, and soon after he was up in Sydney. So he's worked extremely hard. He's been a very effective Labor politician and member of the Commonwealth Parliament, and I'm sure he'll have other things to say in the future about other matters. But for tonight, many thanks for giving us a personal insight into these very troublesome times. Well done, and thank you.
Challenges, innovations, solutions. This is APAC, Australia's public